Hey everybody, CVH here with BetweenTheLanes.net, bringing you the second installment of our card analysis series. As we did last time, we'll be taking a card and we'll be looking at its implications in the meta. Obviously, a card that, we think is already pretty good, can be agreed upon, is being played in a lot of top tier decks, basically describing why it's good, going in depth on the value part of it, implications in the metagame and which decks it's being used in. And as you can see on screen, the card we're going over today is last month's seasonal reward for the ladder. If you've been playing the ladder a lot, you might have copies of this card in your collection, Hist Grove. So obviously, this card, if you've been playing the ladder recently, is seeing a lot of play. Everyone wants to get a lot of the value out of it. Seeing the most play in Scout Ramp, which is a deck that obviously increases max Magicka a lot with cards like Treeminder and Thorn Histmage. That's been its game plan since the beginning, and this is another huge way to take advantage of that. So what it does, summon +1 max Magicka. When you have 15 or more max Magicka, sacrifices itself automatically to summon an 8/8 Swamp Leviathan in each lane. So Swamp Leviathan, just 8/8 vanilla for 7. That's a big animal, pretty much all you can really say about it. Doesn't see constructed play by itself, except in the most budget of endurance decks, because it really doesn't impact the board or anything. But if you're getting 2, all of a sudden that's a huge push on the board. Your opponent isn't likely to have a good answer for both of them, even in a control deck. So what this does is effectively win you the late game if it's going super late. Obviously, Hist Grove as an answer to early decks isn't really too good. So what we're talking about first, as obviously even the control decks can't really answer 2 8/8s in the board. So what we'll be talking about first is how this card can actually get off, because you have to have 15 or more max Magicka to get the effect off, and as you all probably know, if you've been playing any sort of long games of Legends at all, your max Magicka automatically caps at 12, so once you hit 12 out of 12, it just stops there. But the thing about that is, if you're playing cards like Hist Grove that say +1 max Magicka, that number will increase. So if you play a Hist Grove on turn 3, for example, by the time you get to 12 Magicka, the turn after that, you'll go up to 13 out of 13. And if you play 2 more cards that increase your max Magicka by 1, all of a sudden, you give yourself the opportunity to go up to 15 max Magicka by even turn 12. And of course, this can happen even earlier if you're playing a bunch of cards that gain +1 max Magicka and you happen to draw them all and fit them all into your plays. So that's how the Swamp Leviathans hit the board. The turn they hit the board, they obviously have Summoning Sickness and can't attack, so the card is very slow. Not that it wouldn't have been slow already, because you need to wait till that long to summon them, but your opponent does have an answer, or a window of opportunity rather, to answer these Swamp Leviathans. So, obviously in the late game, this changes decks like Ramp Scout's matchups pretty significantly, because in the late game, the deck used to just lose to Control Mage. One of the biggest implications of this card is that all of a sudden Control Mage has to worry about this card that is a 3 of in these decks, that it simply can't answer effectively. So in order to really talk about that, we need to talk about like the appropriate times to play Hist Grove. Because it is a support, and supports like Divine Fervor, which was another card I was considering to do a card analysis on, they do have a hard answer. They have Shadowfen Priest, Vicious Drag, and any other cards that might ever interact with supports. So if you're playing this card early, it could simply die to one of those. And while that doesn't negate the +1 max Magicka ramp effect that you will have gotten by playing it in the first place, it's pretty much just a guaranteed thing that is less important in the long run than your 2 Swamp Leviathans if the game is going to be going late. So against a deck with Endurance, if I'm playing Hist Grove, I typically just don't play it in my hand. Like, I have skipped 3 Magicka, I've floated 3 Magicka on a turn where I could have fit in a Hist Grove that's in my hand, just because I knew my opponent hadn't played a Shadowfen Priest yet, and if they played it on my Hist Grove, I was pretty much giving away a big part of my win condition in that matchup. Obviously, this is situational based, but I do recommend that as a general rule. There's obviously situations where you need to play the Hist Grove and just hope your opponent doesn't have a Swamp Leviathan, for example. It's turn 10, your play is weak, your opponent's already played a Shadowfen Priest or 2 in the mirror match in Ramp Scout, for example. You need to go up to a 12 Magicka Odaving on the next turn, you want to play that next turn. And maybe it's your first Hist Grove, so even if your opponent does play Shadowfen Priest on, you still have 2 more somewhere in the deck, and you still get the Magicka ramp. In situations like that, you can make exceptions, but as a general rule, you really want to watch out for the support interactive removal there. However, against an aggressive strategy, the Swamp Leviathans are probably not going to be your main win condition, because they are very slow, like I mentioned, don't impact the board on summon, like I mentioned, and it's going to be turn 15 by the time they even come out. So basically you will have known whether you won or lost long before then based on your ability to stabilize on the board, and when it comes to that late in the game, you'll be able to put enough pressure on the board with your other cards like Guards, Preserver of the Root, etc., just to stabilize, Odaving them, win the game that way. However, Hist Grove does have some limited use as a ramp card. People kind of overvalue Magicka ramp coming from other games, but gaining +1 max Magicka, while good against an aggressive deck, isn't necessarily going to win you the game. Because you're also skipping your entire turn 3, for example, if you're playing it on turn 3. So there are situations where you can play this card early against an aggressive deck that might not be able to interact with supports, and while it's nice to say, yeah, I'll probably get my Swamp Leviathans like 10 turns from now, you'll basically only be playing it when you don't have anything else to do, and you're ramping into like a turn 4 Thorn Hist Mage to help you stabilize, but it's probably not going to get the job done by itself. In the control mirror matches, what usually winds up happening is that the control deck will play almost no Magic ramp. Maybe if they draw a Thorn Hist Mage or Tree Minder, they'll play those. If they have the Hist Groves, they'll probably just keep them in their hand, hold them for a long period of time. That's one of the ways you can understand if your opponent has a Hist Grove in their hand, is if they've been waiting for a long period of time to play them. And then around turn 12 or 13, your opponent will play 1, 2, or even 3, and the board will just fill up with Swamp Leviathans, and there'll be no good answer because Dawn's Wrath only clears 1 lane, and Manticore only clears 1 of them, and Double Jab only clears 2 of them, and it just gets out of hand really quickly. So a lot of the ways that beat this card in the control mirror matches isn't actually the support removal at all, because your opponent's not likely to give you an early Hist Grove to remove with your Shut Off and Priest. It is basically just to get under your opponent and be able to beat them on the turn the Swamp Leviathans come out, or even before preferably. So while you're playing for the late game in a deck like Control Mage, you probably want to be attacking sooner. So that's what this card has done to change the implications of those matchups. So as long as we are looking at this card and getting to 15 Magicka, it's important to look at the different cards in this game that can actually increase the max Magicka to understand its effectiveness in different decks. So as of right now, we just looked up Max Magicka in the collection. That's how you find all of these that can gain Max Magicka. Hist Speaker, not usually seeing play. While it's in play, your Max Magicka is increased by 1, but it's easily removed. Not super consistent unless you're playing it to actually give you that 15th Magicka when you're playing the Hist Groves to get the Swamp Leviathans. If you're playing it early, it's not consistent enough. Hist Grove itself does increase your Max Magicka, but as I mentioned, it's probably not something you want to play early if you're worried about support removal at all. Tree Minder, one of the more popular inclusions in the decks, doesn't impact the board very much at all, but obviously anything, even a 1/1 guard, impacts the board much more than Hist Grove, which does nothing on the board. So you typically see this card at least as a 1 or 2 of in almost all the ramp decks. The last one people usually play in Simply Endurance is the Venom Tongue. You don't see this card as much because it's pretty weak to Murkwater Witch. Obviously, if it doesn't have an attack power, it can't kill anything and can't gain you the Max Magicka. So it does make it a little bit inconsistent, but it is one of the ways you gain ramp if you really need it. Now, we see this card a lot in the non-scout decks, and the reason for that is because in the scout decks we have Thorn Hist Mage, which is like Tree Minder on steroids, basically. It's a 5-drop 2/5 that immediately becomes a 3/5, guards the board, impacting it against an aggressive deck because they have to deal with the guard all of a sudden. You can play 3 of them, and it increases your Max Magicka immediately. So this is another card that you can play early, you can play late to get to 15, a bunch of utility there. So that's why you see the Hist Grove usually in Scout, because if you're not playing Thorn Hist Mage, since you're not in Scout, you're playing the Hist Groves, you have to double up on Tree Minders more than likely and play more than you'd like, and you have to run a good amount of copies. Basically, between Venom Tongue and Tree Minder, you have your main source of Magicka ramp, and both of these cards are inconsistent in different ways. This is more consistent ramp, but it doesn't do as much on the board. This impacts the board a lot, but if it's answered, all of a sudden you don't get your ramp, and you run the risk of your Hist Grove, at least the first or second copy, being very dead in your hand. So in order to discuss if this card is overpowered, we have to think about its consistency, because obviously if this card went off all the time, it would be very much overpowered. This is a lot of value for a 3 Magicka card. But, so here's the first thing. 2 Swamp Leviathans, 14 Magicka worth of cards. Not gonna happen in the first 10 turns of the game, almost ever. So we don't have to say it's too broken on curve. You are only paying 3 Magicka for the Swamp Leviathans, but at a point in the game where this is your play, it only becomes super overpowered if you have 2 to 3 copies of Hist Grove in your hand, because otherwise you might just not have a play alongside of it. Hist Grove's power comes in its ability to combo with other cards, but unless you have a ton of card advantage, and can play something like Blood Magic Lord, Hist Grove in the same turn, or Hist Grove and like clearing your opponent's board with something, if you're simply floating the rest of your Magicka, which happens a good amount of the time if you're in a top deck situation, in like a control mirror match when you're both whittling each other down, just waiting to draw your Hist Grove, yeah, you are top decking 2 Swamp Leviathans you can play in 1 card, but it's the same as if you had a 15 Magicka card on your deck, and you were simply top decking that. You're floating the rest of your Magicka, so it's not more than you'd expect for a power level at this late in the game card. If this card was weaker, I don't think it would see any play at all. It has to give you a very powerful effect And a lot of that's due to just how dead it is earlier in the game. Because in those control mirror matches, yeah, you can ramp, but like I mentioned, you don't want to be really doing that and opening up your Hist Grove to be removed. So you have to really consider that if you're in a top deck situation on like turn 10 and you're just trying to put a little bit of pressure on the board that your opponent has to answer, or answer your opponent's threats if they're pressuring you, this card does nothing to do that. If this is your first or second Magicka ramp, you're just waiting to get to 15. So at that point, this is probably just the worst card to draw on your deck, unless you know you can live to find more ramp. So that's really the trade-off here. And that's why it's super good in those ramp versus ramp mirror matches, the ramp versus control mirror matches, anything that goes late. This card is going to be very game deciding. When you're simply trying to survive, though, this card really doesn't do a whole lot for you unless you really need the ramp to get to that Thorn Hist Mage or something like that, or an Odebing in a little bit of a late game. So my thoughts on this card are that it's a lot better than I initially thought in the ramp decks, specifically Ramp Scout, mostly just Ramp Scout. I don't think I would probably. Well, I don't think I'd endorse it in other decks quite yet. I've been testing a little bit of the Sorcerer deck. You can check the channel for a Ramp Scout deck list as well as a Ramp Sorcerer deck list that I got from Scissor. The Ramp Scout has been infinitely more effective. That's just because the deck is more suited to support a card like Hist Grove. And it's also, it just has more consistent ramp in general. It's what the deck wants to be doing. Other classes can do other things better, but Hist Grove is really supported right now in Scout. I don't think it's overpowered in that kind of deck. I think this gave another very interesting tool for the deck to use in the late game. I think right now the decks besides Scout are getting away with it, mostly because of this meta being kind of slow. People don't really play a whole lot of fast mid-range decks. Like Archer is pretty much the fastest that you see consistently on the ladder. Some Crusader decks can really get under this card, and people have figured that out. But as more people start to play faster decks, if the meta gets, if there are more card releases that encourage more faster decks as opposed to encouraging slower decks like this card, I expect we'll see a lot less Hist Grove on the ladder. Very good in the late game, very poor in the early game, and the decks themselves that support this card are typically a little bit poorer in the early game as a result. So those are my thoughts. Don't think it's broken, think it's just well positioned in the meta currently, and I don't think that'll last forever. But I do think this is a very interesting tool for Ramp Scout, and I encourage you to try it out. It's a very cool card. I definitely overestimated its potential to be dead in the early game, but due to the meta, as the way it is right now, a little bit slower. A lot of these Scout mirrors, for example, happening. This card is definitely, well positioned, very powerful. Double Swamp Leviathan is very fun to kill your opponent with, and killing your opponent with 6 of them, even better. You will run into situations even now, though, where you play all of your Swamp Leviathans and your opponent just kills you on their following turn, or hey, I can play a lot of Swamp Leviathans, I'm just dead though. But overall, very powerful card for those late game decks, so I encourage you to try it out. A lot of value there. So hopefully you enjoyed the video as we talked about Hist Grove, super hyped card. Let me know in the comments if you have any thoughts about Hist Grove or cards I should analyze in the next video for this. Don't know exactly when I'll do it, but hopefully we can keep picking interesting cards that are impactful in the meta to discuss. Feel free to check out other videos on the YouTube channel and subscribe, and other articles and strategy content on BetweenTheLanes.net. Second metagame snapshot should be up in the next couple weeks as well. So I'll see you next time, guys.